the text that I'll be looking at, the story of Cleobis and Biton, is extremely well known. Many people in the audience have written some extensively about it. And so it was a certain sort of embarrassment that I will try a couple of slightly different ideas to what is already in circulation. I will focus in particular on the meaning of the word tarachodes. And I will argue that a slightly different understanding of the word to the one that I will be showing you as being largely adopted by scholars might also in turn provide a better way of understanding the story, or an interesting way, should we say, of understanding the particular relevance of the story of Cleobis and Biton to the story of Croesus, both what comes before the story is narrated by Solon and after. The word comes, of course, in one of the most famous statements about the divine, and one that very characteristically is not in Herodotus' own mouth, but that Herodotus puts in the mouth of Solon. I've decided that I will be going through the text as well. I'll be reading some of the text both here and when we come to the Cleobis and Biton, because although most people would know these texts extremely well, and we could talk about them without reading them, there will also be some that may not have looked at them recently, so it may still be worth reading them. So Croesus is upset because the fact that Solon has refused to award him that distinction of being the most olbios, the olbiotatos. We'll come back to that, to what that exactly might mean. And he complains, and as a sort of reply to his complaint, Solon comes with this statement: Croesus, you ask me as someone who knows that to Theon, the divine or the gods, is entirely envious and tarachodes. You ask me about human affairs as someone who knows that the divine is Phthoneron, tekai tarachodes. I've chosen amongst the many 5 examples of the way in which the word has been understood and translated. The first goes back to, I've taken Gould as a starting point of what I call recent scholarship, but of course I could have gone much further back. Gould translates, when I am sure that divinity is altogether envious and disruptive. And then it has quite an extensive commentary. Closer inspection suggests that we're not quite dealing with a sort of unified and structured set of ideas that we are entitled to call a theory, but rather with a set of metaphors of very different implication. As we shall see in a moment, this is a theme which is much expanded by Snell more recently. A cycle refers of human experience suggests regularity and recurrence as well as inevitability. The envy of divinity seems to imply a pattern of supernatural intervention in human life, which is recognizably human in its motivation, and hence, once more, in principle, predictable. This is the idea that the Phthoneros bit is predictable, but to tarachodes, disruptiveness, and the recurring idea of chance seemingly stress the randomness and the unpredictability of divine intervention, while the impossibility of a man's possessing all goods seems to point something different again, something more like a natural limitation. So, but what I'm interested here is the idea that disruptive is a suitable translation for tarachodes, and that randomness is the key idea that is expressed by this. Harrison 2002 talks about this passage in a couple of places. First, on page 35, the translation, "The divine is completely jealous and prone to disturb us." Tom, you were suggesting when we were talking about this earlier, this sounds a bit like Powell. In fact, one of the interesting things about the scholarship, if you like, on tarachodes is there is the quite remarkable, seems to me, situation in which the Powell's lexicon to Herodotus gives a translation of tarachodes, which I believe to be true, to be correct, which is actually different from that adopted universally. And then, the passage is mentioned again at much later, at page 191, and in which I will read that Solon does on one occasion make a claim to knowledge to the divine, but his knowledge is of the jealousy of the divine and of the unpredictable consequences of this for the affair of man. Pelling 2006 seems to shift the sort of semantic range from the idea of unpredictability and randomness to the idea of turbulence. I'm not entirely sure why he does that, what does it precisely means to convey by that choice of translation, when I know that all the divine is envious and turbulent. So it is hard to know, he says, what Solon is saying here. But again, he goes with the idea of different layers of meaning. Several different theses merge, and the account leaves it open which of them will prove the most insightful. And he distinguishes between three positions. Life is mutable, anyone's fortune may change. God is envious of those who come closest to divine prosperity, and turbulent in destroying them. So, suggesting, in fact, that there is a connection between the idea of divine envy and the way in which it manifests itself in tarachodes as a modus operandi, as it were. I'm saying this because, and then the third, the most prosperous act of the most prosperous act or things in particular way, in those ways contribute to that destruction, which is another layer of another way of looking at divine agency. And these three are not necessarily straightforwardly reconcilable or unifiable, as it were. And I was referring to the existence of different motifs, different themes, because, and also of the fact that that tarachodes and Phthoneros are seen directly connected, because the idea that they are, is precisely what Vesnel contests. He's very keen on explaining, this is in the second, I've given both passages in which he deals with that simply to provide more evidence of the translation of tarachodes as disturbing. But the second passage is the one I want to look at. First of all, the Greek wording itself, Phthoneron te kai tarachodes, does not invite us to take them as undiades, nor to understand the second predicate as an explicatory specification of the first. Representing the two predicates as two sides of one medal would require a different Greek formulation. The particle group te kai is very frequent in Herodotus, but unlike single kai, in this combination, kai is never used as a so-called explicativum, but always as connective or paratactic. So this implies that in this passage, the divine is characterized as being both envious and disturbing, one or the other, and these are two separate definitions. I realize that nobody is being too kind, because nobody has told me that I have failed to do. I hope that people have managed to follow nonetheless. I have not done this. I apologize, sorry. one and the other. This also follows from a different implication of the two notions. Divine envy always and inevitably result in doom, in a typically human anthropomorphic in its motivation and hence predictable, especially as a satisfactory stuff to beat a very rich dog. Tarachodes, on the other hand, represent the random, confusing and disruptive, but not rationally reducible side of the supernatural. And finally, I have put Anthony Ellis' couple of passages when he provide, in one case, a translation, in another, a sort of a paraphrase interpretation. He goes for disruptive, troubling, or meddlesome. And then it says, by the 5th century and probably earlier, this was often associated with the idea that the gods have a disruptive and grudging, that is, that they are unwilling to share with mortal the unmixed blessing with God's enjoy, and so intervene to disrupt. So he will be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that he doesn't necessarily buy the idea that the two should be treated as completely independent, as it were, categories, to the point that independent mode of agency, to the point that Fesnel, as you can see, assigns, he gives numbers to all these components, and he assigns different ones, 6A and 6B, to the envious and the disturbing, as opposed to seeing the tarachodes, the disruptive, as a direct way in which, the envy, the jealousy operates. Now, this is a sort of rapid summary of the, as it were, state of scholarship on this idea. In the case of Fesnel, but also of others, I would say, my impression is that even though this is not stated explicitly, my impression is that the attempt to make sense of that statement, it's largely it's put into it's operated by looking fundamentally at what follows. If you see on the first of the two quotations from Fesnel, there follows an exposition of various shifts caused by fortune, whims, nobody can be called happy, etc., etc. So the idea that that statement of Solon, it's fundamentally introducing the long discussion that follows. My suggestion, on the contrary, and this seems to me on the line, again, if I understand it correctly, on the line of what Tom was saying in his book, or in his 2000 books, that at least the idea should also be understood in relation to the story of Cleobis and Biton. And this would be my my sort of strong preference. This is what I'm arguing, that fundamentally Croesus does not understand the relevance of the story, does not understand why he has told him that story, and Solon somehow spells it out to some extent by saying that the story exemplifies those two characteristics of the divine. Now, it's at the core of my my way of reading the story of Croesus and Biton. There is the idea that that it makes much better sense, not so much, not exclusively, or not even so much, as a second best version of the story of Tellus. Croesus does indeed ask him, okay, if I don't get first prize, tell me at least who is second. that is not what Solon really does. The way in which the story is introduced, let me, yeah, whom he has seen as second. We'll come back to this idea of seeing, thinking that it would at least bring back second prize. Whether Herodotus, whether we are to imagine that whether the sort of the reported speech asks to imagine Croesus himself using this, frankly, rather inappropriate, agonistic, sport-like language, or whether it's a way of as it were, commenting for Herodotus to comment on Croesus' attitude. The most important fact is that Solon does not give him a straight answer. If I were to summarize what I think that Solon does, is to tell him a logos, or perhaps in a sense even an ainos, a story with a point, with a very specific point, which is meant to teach him, is meant to warn him why it is not a good idea to ask questions like the one he has asked, and more specifically, what happens even beyond, I mean, a warning to him by telling a story which in many ways represents, can be looked at from the point of view of what Croesus has said so far, as a warning as to what happens to those who asks questions like that, or perhaps I should say, who have expectations of that kind. Which is to say that it seems to me that the request of the mother of Cleobis and Biton has not been, at least in the literature that I know, it seems to me has not been recognized as sufficiently recognized as transgressive. So fundamentally, by asking the goddess what she asks, she makes a mistakes, or if you prefer, deliberately choosing this grotesquely anachronistic, she commits a sin comparable, not identical, but comparable to that of Croesus himself. The first thing is the question, the first issue is as to whether one is allowed to ask for a reward for honoring the goddess, because that's what effectively the mother does. Sorry for this scrolling. Oimin etimesan megalos, that she prayed the goddess that she might grant the best things for man to her children Cleobis and Biton, who had given her great honor to the god. At this point, I'm simply out of laziness, but also in a sense to partly out of laziness, and also partly as to show the way in which modern translations do not actually naturally fail to convey the grain, as it were, or Herodotus' language. I'm simply reproducing the godly translation in the Lurb. And I'll come back to how we deal with that sentence. The point I want to make here is simply that what the two athletes have done is to honor the goddess. Now, is one entitled, allowed to ask for a reward for the fact that one has honored the gods? And I would argue that this is problematic, and the answer is probably no. And I've written sort of try to write in a succinct way the reason why not, the sort of reciprocity implied here differs in one fundamental respect from the standard pattern of prayer as typically seen in Homer, when a suppliant in need reminds a deity of their devotion, as shown by sacrifices or indeed the building of a temple. In this case, the reciprocity does not place the human, in the case of the Mary pattern, the reciprocity does not place the human suppliant on the same, what I would describe as a transactional level. And so the story of Agamedes and Trophonius, which Plutarch quotes as having been preserved in Pindar, provide a parallel, but a parallel of a behavior which should be recognized as transgressive. The two, after having built a temple in Delphi, they ask Apollo for their wages. And Apollo's response is that the wage will take the same form as what happened to Cleobis and Biton. That is, they are given the price is that of dying in their sleep, in fact. Now, I'm in order to comment on this, I'm slightly anticipating something that will come back again. But if we take the view that by asking for a mistos, these two are putting themselves in a sort of on a level of transactional equality, as it were, with the divine. One way of seeing, as it were, their so in other words, they enter into an ontological dimension that is other than purely human. That, in a sense, what the gods does is literally to treat them, and hence some kind of analogy with the story of Cleobis and Biton, to treat them in a non-purely human way, and therefore to remove them from the human condition, from the being subject to symphora that defines the human condition. So it is perhaps one could, that there is obviously the story of Cleobis and Biton complicates and in effect simplifies this ambiguity that is there in the story of Agamedes and Trophonius, in the sense that in the story of Agamedes and Trophonius, the punishment, in a sense, for the transgression and the reward are inextricably connected. In the case of the story, by introducing the figure of the mother, by having someone else asking for the reward, the version of the story in Cleobis and Biton quite effectively, in a very sort of clever way, if you like, separates the fact that the reward is, as it were, a real reward, because the fact of being removed from life but without the experience of dying, in a sense, can literally be taken as a reward for the two young men. But at the same time, that also constitute a punishment for the mother. And here I should have quoted, but I very much agree on this particular point, on what Kiasson says about the fact that it would be inconceivable to imagine the reaction of the mother to be other than one of pain and distraught, and that the reason why that is not, as it were, why Herodotus doesn't insist on that, I would say simply because he is not. My own explanation for that is not what he's interested in, because he doesn't want to, as it were, confuse too much the relationship between punishment and reward. But I'm sure we'll be talking about this. So the other form of transgression, which seems to me recognizably to assimilate the predicament of the mother of Cleobis and Biton to that of Croesus, is what I've called the transgressiveness of the superlative expectation. By that, I obviously refer to the fact that she doesn't simply ask for a prize, she asks for to ariston, She asks for the top prize, the top reward, the best thing, which seems to me constitutes an obvious parallel to the fact that Solon doesn't ask to be recognized as in receipt of divine favor, but as the most obvious, the one who most of all is in the receipt of divine favor. And so from this point of view, this represents a continuation of that theme of the transgression of the superlative that is, of course, introduced extremely early in the history via the story of Gyges and Candaule, in which the request is for Gyges to recognize that the wife of Candaule is the most beautiful of all women. This perhaps is the point, given that the emphasis in that story on the act of seeing, perhaps I may go back very briefly to the otherwise rather not obvious way in which Croesus chooses to present his request in terms of he appeals to Solon autoptic, as it were, experience, which obviously has to do with the characterization of Solon, but also has to do perhaps, and this is, I'm mentioning this because it seems to me another example of the continuation of a thematic thread, that sort of misuse of the historiographical ideal that people had already identified in the story of Gyges and Candaules. So the transgressions of the superlative as well, but also, and this would be my last point, the transgressiveness, what I'm trying to describe as the transgressiveness of entitlement, which is shown by both the mother of Cleobis and Biton and by Croesus. Now, in the case of the mother, the entitlement is represented by the fact that the mother prays for the goddess to give to her son the best possible reward, and that could be taken. It's not inevitable, but I argue that it could be taken to suggest that in a way she has already decided that they deserve a reward, even for something which, as I already said, perhaps should not lead to the request of an award. So she has already decided that she deserves an award, and the request is about getting the best possible award. Now, what is certain is that Croesus has decided for himself that his material possessions, all of them, are a sign of divine favor, and he wants Solon to confirm that this divine favor was granted to him to a highest degree than any other human being. I'm not very good at scrolling. And here, I thought that it may be useful to look at a bit of Odyssey that, unless I'm mistaken, has not been brought to bear on what Croesus does, because this bit of Odyssey seems to me to show very clearly that the relationship between possessions and divine approval, divine blessedness, as it were. Odysseus has received a gift from the Phaeacians that make up for what he was carrying, and he has lost. And then it says, I'm reading my translation for now. All that my heart desires has been brought to pass, conveyance and gift of friendship. Pompe kai Philadora, and which Philadora gifts that may the god Poiseian, the Theoi Uraniones, may the god of heaven make them Olbia. So make them blessed to me. So in other words, the Dora in itself are not to be understood straightforwardly and unproblematically as a sign of divine favor. Divine favor, being blessed by the gods, be approved of by the gods, is not something that you can simply automatically derive from your from material possession, from material prosperity. It is something that you pray for as well. And that is the striking contrast with what Solon in fact does. My next point, it's about the precise content of the request. So in other words, what does the mother means to ask, and how does the goddess chooses to understand her request? And this is the particular feature of the story of Cleobis and Biton, in which the tarachodes element may be referred to most directly. The simple point that I would like to make is that the syntax and the meaning of tunkano in the sentence tentheon dunai to anthropo to kein aristonesti can be understood, and in fact has been understood. And I spared you a list of existing translation. I show you that you can find both versions in printed translations, and in two ways. One, tunkano in the sense of to obtain, to receive, which, as we are reminded by Powell, normally take the genitive, but here it doesn't need the genitive because of course the infinitive is in apposition. And so we would translate something like that the goddess should grant to Cleobis and Biton that, i.e. that reward, that prize, which is best for a man to get, to obtain, to receive. The other translation, which is the one adopted by Powell, and Powell singles this out as the only example of this usage in Herodotus, one in which tunkano means to happen, to befall. The goddess should grant that which is best to happen to a man. Now, my simple point is this. The mother thinks that when the mother uttered the sentence with the meaning under 3.1, but the goddess chooses to understand her request in a way in which we can, in a way, expect a god to understand, i.e. not in a mundane material way, but in an ontological, if you like, or theological or metaphysical. In other words, not in a straightforward, simple, obvious way in which the mother thinks she's expressing it. Now, it is this, as it were, this contrast between what the mother intends and what the goddess chooses to understand that may correspond to the idea of tarachodes, when tarachodes would assume the meaning of confounding expectations, or perhaps more simply, as I'm just jumping ahead very briefly, forgive me for doing so, just to show you, that is the meaning chosen by Powell, baffling. Powell does so probably, I would say, because he chooses, and I say he's probably correct in doing so, because he chooses to correct Liddell and Scott. As you can see, I've got now, this is the Liddell and Scott entry. Correct Liddell and Scott in the sense that Liddell and Scott gives our example, which in fact is the first text example of the use of the word. I should have made that clear for those who are not familiar with this, that the word is only used by Herodotus is used by Herodotus for the first time, is not tested before Herodotus, and is only used by Herodotus for this passage and never again in the whole of the histories. Not even when Phthoneron is Phthoneros of Phthoneron is used again. And for this, Liddell and Scott gives given to troubling or disturbing, which is, as we've seen, is the meaning adopted by modern scholar. But Liddell and Scott also acknowledges that the word is used in elsewhere in the sense of uncertain, and also specifically in the sense of baffling. I'm going back now to a footnote in Pelling, in which Pelling comments on Gould. Okay, this is a bit convoluted. And it says that Gould, on page 79, argues that tarachodes points to a randomness in divine behavior and sits uneasily with Phthoneron, which suggests a sharper and more predictable target. That, this is Pelling, that I think misunderstands quite a strange syntax, but I've checked, and this is, I assure you, this is exactly what Chris wrote, which may denote a capacity to disrupt and confuse, and this is the first LSJ meaning, rather than anything confused or unpredictable in the way the capacity is deployed, and this is meaning to the second. Well, I fundamentally disagree, and I would say that, in fact, Powell is correct in understanding the meaning as found in the way in which the word is used in Herodotus as having the meaning of baffling, confounding expectations, rather than all the other alternatives that have been suggested. Now, what follows, it's a fairly sort of long list of passages. Perhaps in the interest of time, perhaps I should take this as an example of the way in which translation probably don't always render this. This is a battle in which the Athenians don't actually chooses not to fight, because whenever they come near to Corcyraean ships, they are concerned about, they come close, but they don't actually engage because they are worried about breaking a treaty. And so perhaps that seems to me, rather than, I would translate that according there was everywhere much tumult, and the battle, the Naumachia, was tarachodes. Actually, you can see how it's not easy to translate. There was much tumult and confusion in the sea fight. Actually, it seems to me that baffling is not a bad translation here too, in the sense that there is something baffling that confounds expectation, in the sense that normally you would expect that when a ship approaches another ship in a naval combat, then they would proceed to attack, but that's not what happens. Or, if you like, another example, I'll come back in a moment to Areopagiticus 30, but there is further on, because this is an example in Herodotus. So I've listed the example of Taras, some example of Taras and Suntarasso in Herodotus, and there is quite a nice one about at 134:1, when the Scythians' ranks were arrayed, a hare ran out between the army, and so every Scythian that saw it gave chase. Tarakhthento then ton Scytheon. Well, yes, there was confusion, but again, to have a hare run in between armies is not perhaps the most sort of predictable, expected. So this sense of bafflement, of something that is not what you expect, should we say, which is not the same as the idea of disturbing, being turbulent, throwing to confusion. It's has more to do with intellectual experience as opposed to the disruptive nature of the agency. And we should look at that passage above because it refers to divine agency. This is about the golden age in which the gifts of the gods were visited upon them, not fitfully or tarachodes, in a way which was unpredictable, which confounded their expectation, but in a way that was the opposite of that. All of this is to come to my my concluding point on the way in which the this theme of confounding expectations when it comes to communication with the divine introduces a very important element that will become an element that will become relevant in the rest of the story of Croesus that follows. And this is, of course, this connection is established by the fact that we are told that Solon is sunte taragmenos by the death of his son. Now, my suggestion is that sunte taragmenos doesn't mean simply distraught, upset, or thrown into on the receiving end of turbulent divine agency, should we say, whatever. I'm trying to use some of the vocabulary that we have already seen. But it means that is confounded in expectations. Why? Because he commits a mistake comparable to that of the mother of Cleobis and Biton. That is, he thinks then when he communicates with the gods, in the case of Solon, he's on the receiving end of divine communication, he can rely, as it were, he's in control of meaning, should we say. I'm referring, of course, to the dream which informed him then his son would have been killed by a spear. And he allows himself, Herodotus plays this very subtly, because as a way of contributing to a not entirely negative, to a problematic, subtle, ambiguous characterization of Croesus, he allows him to adopt for a while, to adopt that very tentative, prudent, that completely the opposite of the confidence that in fact leads to disaster when it comes to expecting to be able to understand the gods in a straightforward, simple way. Because in the end, after having adopted that pose for a while, he ends up being persuaded by the logic of his son, who, by the way, in this way becomes himself the victim of his own, as it were, interpretative arrogance, because neither of them allows for the unexpected, for that which confounds expectations. Yes, he dies by a spear, but he doesn't die in war. And therefore, to allow to go to the hunt is not, and not to war, is not, it doesn't actually remove the danger. There is such a thing as a hunting accident, as, of course, this has to do with the theme of, obviously, to the theme of Symphora. But so the connection is there, but it seems to me the connection reinforces the idea of tarachodes to be understood as representing the divine as speaking in a way that human beings should not presume to control. Another way of putting it would be to say that the divine confounds the expectations of those who do not expect to be confounded, or do not allow for the possibility that, to quote the psalmist, my thoughts are not your thoughts. And on this biblical note, I will stop.